Hi, everyone. Before we begin, I'm excited to share something new with you. As you know, I research, write, record, and edit every single episode on this channel. It's something I take very seriously because I want to bring you the most accurate, detailed, and engaging content possible. I have just launched memberships on the YouTube channel. Now, if you want to support the channel, there's one membership level available right now, and it's just $2.99 per month. With this, you get some exclusive perks like loyalty badges, custom emojis, and my favorite, a first look at all the episodes that I upload. So you get it first before the general public. Memberships, they're a great way to directly support the podcast and help me to continue to produce the kind of content that you love. Of course, I want you to know memberships are completely optional. Every full episode will still be available for free, just like always. But if you enjoy the podcast and want to be a part of helping it grow, I'd love to have you as a member. If you're interested, there's a Join Now button just below on the YouTube video to help you support the channel and become a Beach House Insider. This isn't the only way to support the show. If you want other ways, you can always use Buy Me a Coffee, for example, or PayPal, whichever you're comfortable with. And these are in the links just above under the name of the channel. And if memberships aren't your thing at all, you can still support the channel in a huge way just by liking the videos, subscribing, sharing it with others. It really helps more than you know, and it keeps true crime and paranormal content like this reaching more people. As always, thank you for being a part of this amazing community and for all of your support. Now, let's get into today's case. On August 4th of 1987, a little girl named Carlina, she was just 19 days old, was brought into a busy emergency room at the Harlem Hospital Center, and she was brought in by her parents, Joy and Carl. She had an exceptionally high fever, and the new parents were worried, and rightly so, right? She's 19 days old. The doctors then took this little Carlina and assured them that things were going to be okay, and they admitted the baby to the hospital. A nurse had also been on the same pediatric floor for months and would be one of the people that helped Joy and Carl cope with their girl fighting this fever. Around 12:30 in the morning, Carl took Joy back to her mom's. Joy wanted to grab a few things before heading back to the hospital. Carl then headed home himself and fell asleep. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Carl received a phone call from not Joy, but from the police. They were calling from Joy's mom's apartment. They told Carl that Carlina, the little 19-year-old baby, was missing. In the background, Carl could hear Joy screaming hysterically. Sometime between 12:30 in the morning, around the same time as the nurse shift change, and 3:40 a.m., Carlina's IVs were unhooked and she was taken from the hospital. There was an intense search for the baby, which even went nationwide. A $10,000 reward was even offered by the city of New York. And while leads were followed and a suspect was questioned, nothing ever came of it. Carlina had simply just disappeared. So how could a baby just up and vanish from a hospital, of all places? Where was the hospital staff? Was she even still alive? And most of all, who took her? Welcome to the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth, and tonight we'll hear the story of the girl who solved her own kidnapping. If we're going to make sense of what happened to Carlina, we've got to start with the people who were closest to her, right? Her parents, Joy and Carl. They had been together as a couple for over a year when Joy realized that she was pregnant. Joy was only 16 and she was still a high school student. Carl, on the other hand, he was 22 and he worked 2 jobs. Now, even though they didn't plan on a new baby, in their lives, they were determined to stay together and to raise this child. At the time, Joy still lived at home with her mother. And after Carlina was born, Joy and her mother both took care of her. When Carl had time between his jobs, he would spend time with Joy and the baby. When Carlina was only 19 days old, she developed this very high fever. So Carl, he came over and he picked up Joy and the baby, and they all headed to Harlem Hospital. And this is the same place where Carlina had been born. After checking the baby, the doctor decided that it would be best for Carlina to spend the night in the hospital. They didn't quite know yet what was wrong with her. And so what they did, they wanted to observe her, and they started her on an IV, which was through her foot. That night, she was admitted to the pediatrics ward on the 17th floor. While Joy was in the room with Carlina, Carl knew that he had to let people know that the baby had to stay the night. So he went down the hall to find a payphone. Remember, no cell phones back in the 80s. As he's standing there, he saw a nurse talking with Joy. And Joy would later recall this nurse telling her, "The baby don't cry for you, you cry for the baby." Sounds like a really weird thing for a nurse to say, right? Joy thought so too. Joy wanted to stay the night with Carlina, while Carl, he had to get some sleep so he could make it to his job. But first, Joy needed a few things from home. So together, both Joy and Carl left the hospital around 12:30 in the morning. Carl took Joy back to her mom's, and then he headed home for some sleep. And the next time he would hear from Joy would be at 6 o'clock in the morning, when it wasn't Joy, remember, but a detective that was calling from Joy's apartment. The detective said that Carlina was missing. And in the background, Joy is screaming for Carl to get to the apartment. When Carl arrived, there were police cars outside and detectives standing in the hallway outside of Joy and her mom's apartment. The scene inside was even more chaotic, and Joy was frantic, as you might imagine, right? The police had discovered that around 3:40 in the morning, staff had realized that Carlina was gone. Whoever had taken her had taken out her IV and just left the hospital. The hospital did have security cameras, but they weren't working that night. Staff at the hospital had told detectives that the baby had been checked on every 5 minutes. Okay, every 5 minutes. Joy then told the detectives what this nurse had said to her, the "baby don't cry for you, you cry for the baby" thing, and then went on to describe this nurse as heavyset, wearing a white dress, stockings, and a blue-green surgical smock. Now, a security guard at the hospital did mention that he saw a woman who did match this description, and this woman left the hospital around 3:30 in the morning, but he said that she didn't have a baby with her. But for all we know, she was hiding the baby underneath her clothes, right? What's so shocking is that hospital staff remember seeing this woman on the floor and had seen her for several weeks, but no one bothered to question her. I know, it's crazy, right? Shortly after Carlina's abduction, a woman who was identified as Lucy, 31 years old, was brought in for questioning because she had been identified by witnesses who had seen her at the hospital. Now, this Lucy, she lived in Baltimore, and so the police in Baltimore were notified. They found her and interviewed her, and Lucy, come to find out, was wanted for car theft, and she happened to fit the description. But after questioning her and checking out her alibi, they realized that Lucy was not the person they were looking for. Police believed that whomever this woman was, she had been hanging around the pediatric floor for some time, and that she had studied the patterns of the staff and knew the exact time to strike when no one would be looking. The detectives continued in the search for Carlina, and even the city of New York offered a $10,000 reward. Flyers with Carlina's photo and her information were put out nationwide. Her photo was also added to the National Missing and Exploited Children's Database. She had to start taking anti-anxiety medication. She went to therapy. She left school for a year. Carl, he was very angry, but didn't know how to direct his anger. He would blame Joy, asking, why didn't she just stay at the hospital with Carlina? He would lash out at others. He wouldn't eat. And after a year of not finding Carlina, Joy and Carl ended their relationship. Can you even imagine? I can't. But the pain and the fear and the absolute helplessness that they felt, the not knowing where your child is, if she's okay, why she was even taken in the first place. So many scenarios probably went through their heads and none of them good. Joy and Carl, as well as the rest of the world, would never know the answer about what happened to Carlina until over 20 years later. And it wasn't due to any detective work. Well, at least by the police. It would be solved by the last person you ever expected, Carlina herself. What Joy and Carl didn't know was that their daughter was alive and well and living in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Her name was now Nedra, but she went by Nettie. In 2005, she was a senior in high school when she became pregnant. And at first, she tried to hide her pregnancy, but as time went on, she decided that, you know what, she didn't want to. She was excited. Her cousin had also gotten pregnant at the same time, and she thought they could raise their kids. But the problem was that Nettie needed prenatal care. And in order to get free health care from the state, she needed her birth certificate. When Nettie asked her mom, Anne, about it, she brushed her off and said, oh, she'll handle it. I'll just deal with this. The problem was that Anne wasn't following through, and Nettie got tired of waiting. When Anne wasn't around, Nettie went through all of Anne's papers, and she did find a document that had her name and birth date on it. She then brought this document to the place that she needed to so that she could get her health insurance. But when she passed it over and they did a search for her in their database, they couldn't find her. Now, Nettie assured them that this is what she had, and she began to get frustrated. When the office told her she could not be found, this name and date of birth, this person did not exist. But Nettie continued to push, and they started to question whether Nettie was even telling the truth at all about her own name. Since this document didn't help her get her what she needed, Nettie left and she went back home to tell her mom what happened. Now, Anne was a little ticked off herself, telling Nettie that, hey, I had told you I was going to handle it. But this didn't stop the place that Nettie had gone to from contacting the Department of Children and Families, who then contacted Anne and spoke to her. After this conversation, Anne then told Nettie that she had something that she needed to talk to her about. So later that night, the two of them, Anne and Nettie, sat down, and she told Nettie that Nettie's drug-addicted mother had left her and had never returned for her. Now, Nettie was beside herself. She couldn't believe that the family that she thought to be hers, her cousins, her aunts, her uncles, her grandparents, they weren't really hers. And then she had questions, lots of them. She wanted to know who her mom was. Where had she come from? If Anne knew who she was Nettie left on the doorstep as a baby? And why did Anne never take Nettie to the police or a hospital? Most of all, why didn't she ever tell Nettie? No matter what Nettie asked, Anne told her the same thing, that she had left her and she had never come back. No matter how often over the next few weeks and months, Nettie asked about how she came to be raised by Anne, Anne could not give her a straight answer. But Nettie, she didn't leave it alone. She asked her family caseworker if her DNA could be checked against kids who were considered missing. But she was brushed off, letting her know that, look, this is just the stuff that you see on TV. This isn't real. But it wasn't the first time that Nettie had questions about her mom. She had found out years earlier that relatives of Anne wondered about Nettie just simply because Nettie didn't look like Anne. Nettie would look at photos of both her and Anne, even around the same ages, and wonder why they didn't look at least a little similar. Anne had evidently told relatives that she was pregnant in 1987, the same year that Nettie/Carlina was born. She had left town for a while, and the family just assumed that she'd gone away to have the baby because when she got back, here was this little girl. As Nettie grew up, Anne had sent her to live with her grandmother, who lived in a better part of town during the week so that Nettie could attend better schools. When Nettie was 10 years old, Anne, Nettie's mother, had given birth to a baby boy. And so now Nettie had a little brother. Nettie was very close with her cousins and her aunts, but above all, her favorite was her aunt Cassandra, and this would be Anne's sister. So back to 2005, with Nettie now having had her child, a daughter, Nettie got her high school diploma and she had started working at a hotel. After a while, she decided to move to her own place in Atlanta where her favorite aunt, Cassandra, had moved earlier. There, she worked at various jobs while raising her daughter. Anne would send her grandchild cards and gifts and everything else. Nettie had not told anybody about what Anne had told her about being left by a drug-addicted mom and about Anne having raised her on her own. That is, until she was in Atlanta with Cassandra, and Nettie finally opened up about everything. Cassandra then encouraged her to continue looking for her real mom, and so she did. She'd focus on the date of 1987 and look in the areas of Connecticut for missing children, but, nothing ever turned up. At the time, it didn't dawn on her to look further than the state where she had been raised until she went to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website. There, she scoured photos of babies and came across a photo of a baby girl who was just days old when she was taken from a hospital on August 4th, 1987. The picture that she was staring at looked so much like her own daughter, she couldn't just discard it. So Nettie called the center and she told them that she believes she was abducted as a baby, but she couldn't give a lot of information other than she knew that she was African American. But then she remembered that she had a birthmark on her right arm. After experts took a look at the photos, they did narrow it down to the missing child, Carlina. The center had to have proof, though, so they had to get swabs of DNA from Joy and Carl, as well as from Carlina, now known as Nettie. At the time, and because of the nature of the case, it took a month for the DNA results to come back and prove that, yes, Nettie was in fact Carlina. Before these results were even back, though, Nettie had already contacted Joy. And to say that Joy and Carl were overcome with happiness would be a complete understatement. Nettie, she did seem to have a little bit better communication with Joy than she did with Carl, but I can only imagine what that conversation might have been like. Here is a child you have loved since the day she was born, only to have her taken away from you, not knowing what happened to her, not knowing if she was alive or dead, if she was being taken care of or abused. And here she was, alive and well and willing to speak with you. It had to seem surreal. When Nettie agreed to visit Joy and Carl, she brought along her own daughter, and they, along with Joy's family, spent time getting to know one another. They didn't talk about Nettie's life from the day she had been taken, but instead, they spent most of the time talking about how Nettie looked just like her mom and dad, how some of her mannerisms were the same, and even some habits that they had that were identical. When Carl met with Nettie for the first time, he couldn't stop staring and staring at her, and told her that he didn't care what they did to hang out for the day, just as long as he could be with her and just look at her. But things between Nettie and Carl weren't nearly as smooth as it was with Joy. Evidently, Nettie had quite an attitude with Carl for some reason. So much so that Carl ended up saying, "If that young lady wasn't my daughter, she would have been out of my car a long time ago." Now, the DNA had not yet come back, but while at the airport, of all places, Nettie was found. She was on her way home, and Nettie was found by a man with the NYPD. He had been trying to reach all of them, evidently not knowing that they were all in New York. It was here that Nettie/Carlina learned that Joy and Carl were, in fact, her biological parents. But instead of turning around and contacting Joy and Carl, who evidently didn't even know this information yet, she went ahead and got back on the plane to head back to Atlanta. Now, this didn't sit well with Carl, who said, "If that was me and I found out that these were my parents, I would have never gotten on the plane." And I get it. He does have a point. But here's Nettie just having realized she has a whole other family, her actual biological family, who are happy to have her there in New York. She's meeting all of these new people. It had to be overwhelming. This is something that Joy and Carl have been living with for over 20 years, but Nettie has only just been exposed to it for a fraction of the time. So it's kind of in that way understandable that, look, she just might want to take some time for herself. Plus, she had her daughter with her. Then what happened is someone contacted the press, and it was big, big news. No child in history had ever been missing as long as Carlina/Nettie and then become reunited with their birth parents. The press was relentless. Even when the New York Post wanted to fly Nettie back to New York and put her up in a hotel room with her parents, she agreed and she came by herself. But the press covered the whole front of the hotel just waiting for Nettie to say something. The press even booked rooms on the same floor as her so that she couldn't even leave her room without someone noticing her. She even had to leave out the back way through the kitchen of this hotel just to get away. The New York Post, who had put her up in this hotel, did interview Nettie about her childhood, and she told them that her mother, Anne, was an addict who was often in a haze, saying that drugs and weapons were always lying around. Nettie knew when Anne was coming down from a high because Anne became what Nettie called a monster, and she would have to leave the house before Anne got to that point. Anne evidently had hit her in the face with a shoe once, leaving a mark. After the interview, though, Nettie attempted to justify this, saying that this was just normal growing up where they grew up. It wasn't any different in anyone else's house. You just knew that you were going to get beat. She then says that she was never abused. Then there was this whole deal about a trust fund. And this really, boy, the press really had a fun time with this one. Some say that Nettie was only after this money, but Nettie then explains why she even asked about this. So, what was this? And let's kind of talk about this so we're all on the same page. After Carlina had gone missing, Joy and Carl sued the city of New York, who ran Harlem Hospital, and they sued them for $100 million. There was a settlement in 1992 for $750,000. And after legal fees and other costs, each parent received about $162,600. Both parents, both Joy and Carl, agreed to each take half of this money and put it in a trust fund for Carlina should she return by her 21st birthday. When she hadn't, the trust was then liquidated in 2008, and each parent received back what they had put in, roughly $81,000 each. At some point, Joy and Carl had gone on a morning show. And when they were asked about this trust fund, Joy said, I have two other kids and I had to take care of myself. I had to live. And Carl said, some parents probably wouldn't put any money away. He then said that he lost much of this money in a divorce. Nettie, though, felt betrayed by this. The overall sense was that the only reason that Nettie wasn't getting back in contact with them was because of this money. Nettie had said that an attorney at the time had asked Nettie to mention this trust fund to Joy. And Nettie didn't want to do it in person. She felt very uncomfortable about it. So instead, what she did is she asked her over text. But then assumed that after she received the response from Joy and Nettie then texted back, okay, that this response evidently wasn't taken the way it was meant to be taken. And wow, there's a lot of truth to that even today when we text each other, right? After some time, though, the three of them did get back in contact with each other and understood that this trust fund thing was just this huge, huge misunderstanding. And I'm sure the press didn't help with it at all, right? So, what happened after this? Well, years later, Nettie would change her name back to what it should have been, Carlina. Now, while all this is going on, okay, all of this is happening, the FBI is now looking for Anne. Not only did Nettie just realize she has this whole other family, but that her mother, the mother who raised her, is a kidnapper. Anne was facing federal charges from 20 years to life for taking Carlina. Now, eventually, Anne is found and arrested on January 23rd of 2011. And we'll get to Anne's story here in a second. But I was curious, what in the world caused Anne to abduct Carlina from the hospital on that day? Why abduct a baby at all? Well, court documents indicate that Anne Petway had significant psychological issues at the time. No one should be surprised, right? Not a sane person probably wouldn't take a baby. She had been severely depressed after having 3 stillbirths and several miscarriages. Anne's childhood was incredibly difficult. Cassandra, the aunt whom Nettie had grown very close to, stated in court documents that their mother, so Cassandra and Anne's mother, Mary, she was a very strict Southern mom and remembers their mother using belts and extension cords to beat Anne when they were younger. Yet remember, this is the same woman that Anne took Nettie / Carlina to live with during the week so that she could go to a better school. So after Anne was captured, she entered into a plea agreement and didn't end up going to trial at all. In court documents, Nettie, who is now Carlina, said that the stories about the abuse from Anne were not correct. She doesn't know where they came from, that she and her brother were raised in a good home where Anne did all of the things that she was supposed to do. As the documents talk about her sentencing, it goes on to say that she was so depressed about these stillbirths and the miscarriages that she had that she acted without forethought. Now, we all know that she spent time scoping out the hospital, that she dressed in clothing so that she would look like a nurse in order to get by security, etc. How is this not forethought? What her attorneys are trying to do, what Anne's attorneys are trying to do, is to get her 10-year sentence reduced to less, stating that by the time she gets out, she will be in her 60s and very unlikely to reoffend. The exhibits in this document are from Anne's mom, her sister, Cassandra, Anne's son that was born after Carlina was abducted, and even from Anne herself. And these exhibits are just letters. And all that they are is they talk about what a great mom Anne was, even though that she did this terrible thing. You know, I can only imagine what, on the other side of things, what Joy and Carl think about this. In essence, this whole document is to make sure that Anne does not get a long prison sentence. I mean, these writings and these documents, they're just overflowing with praise for Anne. It's, oh, she was the perfect mom. She did all this, she did all that. In other court documents, though, we learn a little bit more about Anne that wasn't essentially talked about in the other documents with her defense team. In 1977, Anne had been convicted of robbery, which resulted in a sentence of time served of 29 days imprisonment. In 1991, she was convicted for forgery. She received an 18-month suspended sentence and 3 years probation. That same year, she was also convicted of larceny, which resulted in an unconditional discharge. And remember, this is 1991. So she would have had Carlina by that time. In 1993, Anne was convicted of larceny because she used another person's identity to get a car phone and phone service installed in her car. And in 1997, when Carlina, Nettie at the time, would have been about 10 years old, Anne was convicted for possession of marijuana in Connecticut. And this resulted in a 90-day suspended sentence and a 1-year conditional discharge. In 2010, just before she was arrested, she had been convicted of attempted embezzlement in North Carolina, where she now lived. She received a sentence of 4 to 5 months in prison and 24 months of probation. What she had done is she had tried to steal clothing from a department store, but then was allowed to plead to a lesser charge of attempted embezzlement. She had also admitted to the probation department that she used cocaine from 1983 to 2005 and smoked marijuana every day until she was in her early 30s. And this absolutely paints a very different picture of Nettie's home life at the time. Not some awesome mom that bent over backwards for her kids. In this document, the prosecution is looking for a much longer sentence for Anne, not just the 10 years or less because of her age. When Anne was finally sentenced, she received 12 years in prison and paroled. She was paroled after 9.5 years. At the time she was sentenced, she was 50 years old. She was released on April 14th of 2021. In the end, I guess you could say that justice was served and things sort of worked out. I mean, Carlina did find her own birth parents, and Anne was arrested for the crime of kidnapping. But, Carlina's actual parents ended up going through their own personal hell for over 20 years. And I wouldn't wish that on my own worst enemy. One good thing did come of this, though. At the time Carlina was kidnapped, security for infants in hospitals was non-existent at best. Since then, significant changes have been made. Hospitals began to use tamper-proof electronic bracelets for newborns. Stricter protocols were put in place for staff identification. It still floors me that Anne was able to walk around the hospital and no one questioned why she was there. Maternity wards in many hospitals now have secure entry systems that can only be accessed by a staff member, and cameras are pretty now commonplace everywhere. This doesn't mean it's foolproof. It still does occur, believe it or not, but there's been a significant drop since Carlina's case. So as we wrap this up, keep in mind that Carlina's case is truly remarkable. She was incredibly fortunate. Now, she might not have had the upbringing that her parents had hoped she would have. But unlike some others, she at least survived it. Some weren't as lucky. And it's the efforts of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to prevent cases like Carlina's from happening again. And if you want to learn more or help, I encourage you visit their website at missingkids.org. I'll have the link in the show notes for you. I truly hope that you enjoyed this episode. I found it incredibly fascinating and am quite in awe of Carlina's efforts and her stubbornness to find out just exactly who her parents were. I mean, if it hadn't have been for her efforts and her aunt Cassandra encouraging her to say, hey, you need to keep up with this, I don't know that the parents and Carlina would ever, ever, ever have met. So, yeah, truly, truly fascinating. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk again next week when I'll have another very, very interesting episode for you. So stay tuned for that. We'll talk soon. Bye for now.